To welcome the Reverend Nigel Anderson on behalf of Museum and Tascan and for the talk tonight on the disruption of the Church of Scotland and its impact on Scotland's social history. This talk's one of two talks that have been organised as part of the activities programme, which is running alongside our special exhibition, which is on through the museum at the moment, which is Scotland's photograph album, the Mackinnon Collection. And that exhibition is on loan from National Galleries of Scotland and National Library of Scotland. It's on until the 18th of June, so if you've not been yet, there's still time to go and have a look at it during the museum opening times. So I would urge you to have a look at the exhibition. And I'd like to also mention that the talk's being recorded tonight so that we can put it on the museum YouTube channel after the event. So, as I was mentioning, we've got another talk on Saturday afternoon when Blake Milteer, who's the curator of the Mackinnon Collection, will be coming to do a talk on how the disruption influenced the development of photography in Scotland. I also should have pointed out that we've got a couple of images up on display of the famous disruption painting, which has been, the image has been loaned to us from the Free Church of Scotland. The original paintings on display in their headquarters in Edinburgh. And that painting is one of the reasons why the disruption has an influence on photography. But without any further ado, I'll hand over to Nigel and I'll move out of the way. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me over. It's a real pleasure, a delight to come back to my wife's homeland. I've been coming over to Lewis for over 40 years, and it's just wonderful to be back here and to really say a little on the whole aspect of the disruption. And maybe at this point I might pause because I take it this is another person. There's always one more.
No problem. Just starting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, two more. I know these people.
Any minutes? Yeah, just go and have a seat. Just have a seat there. And
Take two. So, free at last, the genesis that led to an exodus is always like that. This man. I thought ex-military were meant to be on time. And, well. Good evening, Major. Right, for the third time. Anyway, I was thanking everyone for their kind invitation to come. I was mentioning this is a very familiar patch in my own coming backwards and forwards over the Minch. I think the first year I came over here was 1980. And since then, well, the rest is history in many respects. But we're here to look at the subject of the disruption. A title, what to give for the title. I suppose it came free at last. Obviously, that was the Martin Luther King reference in the 1960s, but I think it is a reasonable title to give to the disruption when the Church of Scotland, free as it initially became known as, realised its freedom from state control, freedom from the intrusion of the authorities and the appointing of ministers. Of course, we'll come to all that detail in a moment. And it certainly was a genesis that led to an exodus. It was the genesis of a new denomination that really led to the exodus, or an exodus of many, about a third of ministers from the established Church of Scotland, together with about a third of the congregations that departed from the established church in 1843. And again, we'll see more on that later. Interestingly, almost all the Gaelic-speaking congregations left the established church in 1843. But, you know, when we're looking at a historical event, an event that happened almost 200 years ago, it's no mere history for history's sake, but really it's a channel. When we look at a historical subject such as the disruption, it's a channel through which we can really understand so much of our present day ecclesiastical and even cultural realities. And so we're going to look at the consequences of that momentous event that you see there. Again, I'll say a little bit on that picture towards the end of my address. I know you've got the talk on Saturday, which of course will go into the painting in a lot more detail, no doubt the technical aspects of the painting. But before we even get into the subject itself, I do want to just say a few things with regard to a personal caveat. Because I'm not here to give any kind of partisan approach to the formation of this new denomination. The new denomination became known as, eventually became known as the Free Church of Scotland. And as most of you know, yes, I'm a minister in the Free Church. I'm now back in Skye after over 20 years away from Skye. I was a teacher in Portree High School for many years. Back in Skye now, minister in Patronage Free Church. I was born in the Free Church. I was brought up in the Free Church. And even 2 weeks ago, I attended the Free Church Assembly. I'm married to, as I said, a Leosach from Stornoway. She was born in the town. She was brought up in the Free Church. I taught history in ETS, Edinburgh Theological Seminary, for 4 years. But at the same time, I'm a student of history as well as a teacher of history. And I hope as much as I can to speak objectively on the whole subject of the disruption of 1843. I'm not here to persuade anyone to a particular denomination. I think most of you are already persuaded anyway. I'm not here to persuade you even to a particular form of church government. But I want to present to you the significant events that happened in the mid-19th century that really changed the ecclesiastical map of Scotland, had an enormous impact in the culture of the country, and certainly, not exclusively, of course, but certainly to a great extent in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Just one more thing to say before we actually launch into the subject. This is actually very much a family concern. My late father, as some of you knew him, my late father was the caretaker of the Free Church College. He was the caretaker, I believe, was it from 1974? I can't remember when he retired, and it was when he was 65, so that would have been 1995. And as many of you know, he actually became one of the leading authorities in the disruption painting. Again, as you know, he could identify certainly the vast majority of the people in that painting. He wrote this booklet, A Guide to the Free Church of Scotland College and Offices. And if you've got a copy, it's well worth reading. And of course, as you know, he was registered blind. My brother actually works for the National Gallery of Scotland, and he's actually one of the very few people who's actually removed the painting from its location in the mound, and he had to remove it to put it in as a central part in an exhibition of Dio Hill's photography some 5 years ago. And he told me recently that, as he said, the days that he deinstalled and reinstalled the painting, to reinstall a year later, he said, were two of the strangest days he's ever had. I don't know how they got that painting out of the building and down the mound into the National Gallery, but, well, he said these were the two strangest days, or some of the two strangest days he's ever had. Well, I hope this won't be a strange evening for you. So the disruption and what followed. Well, in many ways, this really is a largely forgotten chapter in Scottish church history. won't be taught, or you won't find it taught in schools. I don't think so. As I said, I taught history for many years in state high schools. Never taught it in school. Even in Scottish churches, whether Free Church, Church of Scotland, Reformed Presbyterian Church, whatever Presbyterian denomination, I don't think it's particularly well known. And yet the events that we're going to look at really had the most enormous repercussions for Scotland, certainly at the time, even reaching into the present day. So, what about the disruption? Well, to understand the causes of the disruption, there were 450 ministers, a third, as we said, a third of the ministry of the established church at that time. Why they seceded from the Church of Scotland? You really have to understand really what happened, why it happened, what were the causes. We can look at background causes, we can look at immediate causes, we can look at the triggers that happened, very close to the event itself. And remember, these 450 men, they had their stipends paid by the state. And, when they left their manses, left their congregations, there was an unknown as far, and humanly speaking anyway, an unknown as far as their livelihood was concerned for them and for their families. There were certainly no state benefits in 1843. There was no safety net, in terms of keeping them above the breadline. These men and their families faced enormous challenges. They faced an enormous uncertainty. But they did what they did out of a matter of principle. And that principle concerned the whole subject, the whole matter of patronage. Now we've got to understand what patronage was, the right of a patron, the right of, usually anyway, a landowner, a right of a patron to appoint to a ministry position. And that was such a crucial factor in the ultimate cause of the disruption. And of course, we've got to understand what patronage looked like. What was the basic structure of patronage? And then we're going to look at three important examples that showed the abuse of that system. And it was a system that had been passed in law, state law, in the Patronage Act of 1712. The patron, or he was known, the heritor, he had the right to nominate what was called a presentee. He had the right to nominate that presentee to a vacant congregation, and that person was either accepted or rejected by the congregation. And the patron usually was the largest landowner in the particular parish. But also, there were patrons who were appointed by the Crown. In other words, we would call it nowadays the Minister of State, or Secretary of State, the Scottish Minister, as he was known as then. But problems were so often caused by these heritors. Many of them weren't even resident in the parish, or many of them weren't even members of that particular denomination, the established church. Many of them were Episcopalian, and yet they were given the right to nominate presentees, ministers to the Church of Scotland. So the right of patronage, it was a civil possession, and it was under the jurisdiction of the civil courts. That was going to be crucial in the years leading up to 1843. The presbytery had functions, of course, and really had that obligation to ensure that, well, the man who was inducted was acceptable to the kirk session and acceptable to the heads of the families in the congregation. And there was all kinds of, we'd almost use the word shenanigans going on, because there was a political side of things as well. Politicians could see, the presentation to particular parishes really as a means to preserve their own power, their own political power. And the governments of the day, they could, well, they had their own Scottish minister who would appoint to particular parishes, and they could see the advantage of having someone in that parish who was sympathetic to that particular government. And so you know, the system itself, by and large, was harmonious, by and large. And yet there were so many abuses of the system. Patronage was a system then that, well, was a crucial factor in the disruption of the church. As I said, we're going to look at 3 practical examples that show just how abhorrent patronage was in its extreme form. We have to consider another background cause to the disruption, and that's the growth of evangelicalism in the Church of Scotland. Because throughout the 18th century, the evangelical wing of the church, well, it fought the patronage system on the basis that it argued that the patronage system was actually preventing evangelical ministers from being appointed to parishes. And those who opposed patronage, they were known as the Popular Party. They defended the rights of the people. Popular equals people. And that's crucial when we come to realise the whole basis of disrupting from the Church of Scotland, the centrality of the people, the people's right to choose, the people's right to choose whom they considered it was to be their minister. So the Popular Party, the evangelical ministers, but the system of patronage was defended by another party in the church, the party that became known as the moderates. Many of them, not all of them, but many of these people in the moderate party, they weren't evangelical. There were actually many in the church who were evangelical, but they said that the law of the land has to be kept. We'll go back to the 1760s. As I say, we're looking at background causes, years, decades even, before 1843. And you've got to go back even as far as the 1760s to see there was this growth in evangelical preaching. And it led to the great evangelical revivals in the early 19th century. So there's this increased evangelical fervour that leads to an upturn in church attendance. And at the same time as there's this increase in church attendance, there's this growing awareness of the inadequacy of the provision of church buildings for the more people who are attending not just in the lowlands, but the highlands and in the islands as well. So despite the lack of support of the heritors, despite the hostility of the moderate party in the General Assembly, evangelicals had a leader. They were under the leadership of Thomas Chalmers. And the evangelical party, the Popular Party, grew in influence in the General Assembly, the highest court in the land. So patronage, growth of evangelicalism, these are the background causes. We're going to understand what happened in 1843. But there were controversies. And they form what's known as the 10 years conflict. And we're really coming to immediate causes. Causes that happened, 10 years within even a year or so of the disruption itself. But these causes that, increased the fervour, the desire for an independent denomination, independent of the civil jurisdiction. The 10 years conflict, 1834 rather, to 1843. And this is where we have to go into a little more detail than we've done before. Because in May 1834, as we said, we began what was known as the 10 years conflict. And in that time, we see the evangelical party, not literally of course, but crossing swords with the moderates. And the battleground, if you like, all concerned the principle and practice of patronage. And this came about through the passing of the General Assembly. Remember, it's now got an evangelical majority, the passing of what was called the Veto Act. And by this Veto Act, the Church of Scotland, the Church gave the right to male heads of families in the congregation to reject, to veto a presentation that the patron had given. Okay, they could veto, they could say no. If a patron had nominated this person, the congregation would say no. You know, obviously they couldn't say on the basis of any kind of personal animosity, but no, they had this right. The congregation were given this right to veto this. This tells us that the evangelical party in the General Assembly have now reached a majority. And we want to look at three dramatic cases that really summed up this conflict that ultimately led to disruption in 1843. The first was in October 1834 in Auchterarder. Again, there's a lot of detail here, and there are names. If I was a bit more technologically minded, I'd have these names on my board and so on, so you're just going to have to listen. In October 1834, the parish of Auchterarder was presented with a probationer, a man called Robert Young. But his presentation was vetoed by the congregation in Auchterarder. There were 330 heads of families in that parish. But only 2 of these heads of families actually signed the call. 287 heads of families dissented. The presentation was made by someone who didn't even live in the parish, the Earl of Kinnoul, the patron. And the Earl of Kinnoul, his legal agent, he appealed to the synod, you know, the next court above the presbytery. He appealed to the synod of Perth and Stirling. And they said, oh, there were certain defects in the call to, or actually dismissal of this person, Robert Young. April 1835, the synod of Perth and Stirling, they dismissed the appeal of Robert Young. Robert Young made a further appeal to the General Assembly. And in 1835, General Assembly, May 1835, the General Assembly agreed that Mr. Young's presentation to Auchterarder was invalid. And they said the presbytery of Auchterarder was got to reject his presentation. And you go way forward into March 1838, 3.5 years after the first presentation. The Court of Session, remember, this is a civil court, this is not a church court. The civil court, the Court of Session, they heard Young's appeal and they delivered its decision. 8 votes to 5. The Court of Session decided that by rejecting Mr. Young's presentation, the presbytery of Auchterarder had infringed the civil rights of the patrons and the presentee. So the Court of Session instructed the presbytery to take Mr. Young on trials for licence, even though only 2 people initially had agreed to his appointment. He was to be inducted to the parish of Auchterarder. So in other words, the Veto Act that had been passed by a church court, the General Assembly, the Veto Act was deemed to be illegal. Presbytery was ordered to disobey its own laws. And we move on. In April, we reached April 1838. Things weren't finished in Auchterarder. The presbytery of Auchterarder, they decided to refer the whole matter to the synod of Perth and Stirling. Again, Robert Young protests. The General Assembly meets in May 1838, and it agrees that the spiritual independence of the church must be upheld. We move to the next year, May 1839. The House of Lords, civil court, the House of Lords upheld the decision of the Court of Session. So the Veto Acts, again deemed to be illegal. 2 lords have said so. And they actually said, and it's quite incredible when you hear these words mentioned, that the right of the call of a minister, they said, was an obsolete formality, no legal status. So that's Auchterarder. And then the second case, a place called Lethendy, also in Perthshire. Again, there are names that we have to keep lodged in our heads. Back to 1835, a man called Thomas Clark. He's a probationer. He's presented by the Crown this time, not by a landowner, but by the Crown. He's presented by the Crown as an assistant minister, and someone who was going to be the successor to a very old minister who was at Lethington. And the supposition was that when that old minister died, this young man, Thomas Clark, would succeed him. But when the old minister died, Thomas Clark was to be appointed as the new minister. Parishioners at this small place, Lethington, rejected this man, Thomas Clark, 53 votes to 22. The presbytery refused to accept the presentation. An appeal was made to the Synod of Perth and Stirling, and then another appeal to the General Assembly. June 1836, the presbytery, or the Synod rather, upheld the presbytery's decision. The Crown, unusually, but the Crown actually withdrew the presentation of this Mr. Clark. They presented another probationer, a man called Andrew Kesson. And actually, the heads of families this time, they liked this man, Andrew Kesson. Okay, so the Crown have appointed this man, the heads of families have agreed this is the right man. But what about poor Mr. Clark? What about Thomas Clark? He's still in the picture. He obtained actually an interdict from the Court of Session. That interdict that ordered the presbytery of Dunkeld not to proceed with the induction of this new man Kesson. Presbytery took the matter to the General Assembly of 1838 and the Commission of Assembly in 1838. That commission decided that the admission to the pastoral charge of a parish and congregation was entirely an ecclesiastical act, and it ordered the presbytery to proceed with the induction of Mr. Kesson. Okay, this was the second person, as about the man whom the congregation liked. So Mr. Kesson was ordained. He was inducted to the congregation, September 1838. Mr. Clark, the man who, was meant to be the successor of the old minister, the man whom the congregation didn't want. Mr. Clark initiated an action in the Court of Session. Yeah, and he initiated this action against the presbytery for breach of interdict. And in June 1839, Court of Session, they summoned the presbytery of Dunkeld to go to Edinburgh. And the judges in the Court of Session, by a small majority, actually decided, well, we're not going to imprison the presbytery. They had that right to imprison the presbytery. They said, well, we won't imprison the presbytery. We'll censure them. We'll impose, court costs on them. And, well, they did threaten imprisonment if there was any further disobedience by that presbytery. And so the Court of Session passed a judgment. And it's interesting, the Court of Session under the Lord Advocate Charles Hope gave a warning. He could see what was happening. He could see that there was the possibility of a disruption from the established church. He said this: as for those ministers of the church whose conscience cannot submit to the law so long as it remains the law, I'm afraid nothing remains for these ministers but to retire from the established church. It's impossible, so they should remain ministers of the established church and yet reject the law by which they have become established church. So, that Lord Advocate could see what was coming, and that's when about middle of 1839. One more case, a place called Strathbogie. And now we're up in Berkshire. Another intervention by the Court of Session. Back to 1837, a probationer, a man called John Edwards. Ministers could be schoolmasters at the time. A lot of ministers were schoolmasters. This was a man who was a schoolmaster in a neighbouring parish. And he was presented by the patron, the Earl of Fife, presented to the congregation at a place called Marner. Mr. Edwards, actually, he had been before, he'd been an assistant minister in Marner. But, well, there were 300 heads of families in Marner. But only one of these heads of the families, and this man was the one who owned the local innkeeper, he was the man who owned the local pub. Only he signed the call. The only one out of these 300 actually signed the call for John Edwards. And 261 heads of families vetoed that call. So the presbytery has to act. Presbytery goes in the instructions of the General Assembly and they reject the presentation. And only one person has signed the call. And so the patron realised this isn't working. And so they put someone else in John Edwards' place, a man called David Henry. This was an evangelical. And he succeeded. He'd actually succeeded Edwards as an assistant minister in the parish. And this was actually a very popular presentation. The congregation in Strathbogie actually liked this man, David Henry. Mr. Edwards secured an interdict in the Court of Session that forbade the presbytery from proceeding with the induction of the second man, David Henry. The Court of Session issued this decision in favour of Edwards, the man who only had one head of family to sign the call. And the Court of Session ordered the presbytery to take this man in trials for ordination and to proceed with his induction. We come to the beginning of 1839, December 1839. The majority of the presbytery there of Marner in Banffshire, they wanted, a peace. They wanted a ceasefire. They, didn't want to go through all this struggle between ecclesiastical and civil courts. And they actually decided to obey the Court of Session, take Mr. Edwards on trial to prepare him for ordination. And these 7 ministers, they obeyed the Court of Session, and because of their actions, the General Assembly suspended them. 21st January 1841, these 7 ministers, they met at Marner, they ordained the man who only had one person to support his call, Mr. Edwards. So they met and ordained that man. Immediately, I think many of you know what I'm going to say next. Just before the ordination, remember this is winter time, snow's on the ground. The congregation, and it's estimated that there was a fantastic number of people there. The congregation rose, they left the church and they walked through the snow in protest. And Chandler's biographer wrote this. It was an ordination altogether unparalleled in the history of the church, performed by a presbytery of suspended clergymen on a call by a single communicant against the desire of the patron, in face of the strenuous opposition of a united Christian congregation, in opposition to the express injunction of the General Assembly, the sole bidding under the sole authority of the Court of Session. Okay, so, we're really sunk into the immediate causes, things that are happening as we get closer and closer to 1843. But the pace of progress, if you want to call it that, towards the disruption really accelerates from May 1841. As we come to the General Assembly of 1841. And by 216 votes to 147, there's a motion proposed by William Cunningham. And William Cunningham's call for the total abolition of patronage. I'll read the motion that was passed. That the General Assembly, having considered the overtures and patronage, resolve and declare that patronage is a grievance, has been attended with much injury to the cause of religion in this church and kingdom, is the main cause of the difficulties which the church is at present involved, but it ought to be abolished. And Thomas Chalmers supported the motion. Yet, for a time he was hesitant, but he supported the motion. And with Chalmers' support, things are moving on. He is very much considered the leading man in the evangelical group. And from that motion that was passed, General Assembly of May 1841 passed a document called the Claim of Right, claim, declaration and protest against the encroachments of the Court of Session. It's one of the most important documents in the whole of Scottish Church history. 5,000 words. And what it's saying, if you want to summarise it in a few words, it really asserted the Church's claim to spiritual independence. And Chalmers said, this is the Church's final appeal. He's saying, if Parliament rejects the Church's claim to all its historical privileges, Chalmers said the evangelical, certainly majority in the Assembly, they'd be forced to give up the benefits in their connection with the state. As I said, things are moving on apace. June 1842, Prime Minister Robert Peel, he announces in the House of Commons this decision. The government had no intention of bringing forward any legislation to remedy the grievances and the claim of right. The claim was known as the protest. August 1842, the House of Lords gives its decision in the Melter Arbour case. Remember going back to this man, Earl of Canule, not in the parish itself, appointing Robert Young, and the decision is given. The Court of Session decides in favour of the Earl of Canule and Robert Young. And the Court of Session actually sued the Presbytery of Melter Arbour for £16,000 damages. Now, that's an incredible amount of money at the time. So the Court of Session has decided in favour of an individual who had hardly any support from the congregation. And so really what that meant is this, August 1842, this meant that really individual members of Presbytery are now liable to civil penalties for fines. In fact, as we said before, even imprisonment. They rejected a presentee. They were liable to fines, if not worse. Moving on apace, 17th of November, 1842. There's a special convocation held in Edinburgh. 465 members attend this convocation and they meet to support the principle of spiritual independence. Thomas Chalmers calls this meeting. There are other leading evangelical ministers there at the meeting as well. And no public was meant to be there, but like everything that does happen, unfortunately, in churches, news got out. And Chalmers at this meeting, really, they were laying the basis of a new church. And he introduced a plan to finance a new denomination, a free church. And money was to be collected from local congregations, and that money would be distributed to ministers in the new denomination. I'll come back to that later when we look at the cultural impact of the denomination. Because obviously new churches would have to be built, new manses would have to be built, ministers would have to be paid, schools even, universities funded, church extension, slums needed churches, rural areas needed churches. And yes, I mean, this convocation approves these changes. And again, rejects the whole principle of patronage. I'll maybe skip that next bit here, but we're coming to now into 1843. The government makes this final decision. It will not consider the claim of right of the evangelical party. February 1843, House of Commons, they debate an appeal from the Commission of Assembly against the Court of Session's decision in another case, the Stuarton case. Church's petition is rejected. April 1843, 400 local associations are formed. to raise money for a new church, for a future ministry in a free church. And Chalmers announces in 1843 that £1,000 a day is coming in to this new church. £1,000 in 1843. Well, that's over £100,000 in today's equivalent. And then 17th of May, 1843. A large meeting of ministers and elders. They meet in St Luke's Church in Edinburgh, and they meet to finalise plans to separate from the established church. And James Mackinnon of Glasgow said this of that meeting: "The meeting last night was like all that preceded it, full of harmony and mutual love. For there was much solemnity. There was at the same time the greatest cheerfulness. Men seemed to be enjoying the calm consciousness of discharging a high and sacred duty." Then we come to the big day itself and the drama of that day. I mean, in 2022, you wouldn't get the same level of a dramatic, incident like this. But let's put it like this: 5 a.m., 18th May, St Andrew's Church in George Street, Edinburgh, just there a couple of weeks ago. There's a public gallery in St Andrew's Church. By 5 a.m, that public gallery was filled to overflowing. I mean, the assembly wasn't meant to start until 2:30 that afternoon, but 5 a.m, the public are there. And there's a crowd outside the church. And thousands, you can see a pictorial picture of what it looked like. But there's thousands outside the church when the Royal Commissioner, Lord High Commissioner, appears. Earlier, before 2:30, the retiring moderator, Dr. Welsh, preached in St Giles, Romans 14, verse 5. Every man be fully persuaded in his own mind, and obviously there was a direct reference to what was about to happen. And the assembly walked from St Giles to St Andrew's Church in George Street. And then Dr. Welsh took the moderator's chair. Then prayer. But instead of doing what was normally done then, reading the roll of commissioners, there was what was described as breathless stillness. Dr. Welsh made the following statement. He said this, and there's quite a long statement. It's worth hearing. "Fathers and brethren, according to the usual form of procedure, this is the time for making up the roll. But in consequence of certain proceedings affecting our rights and privileges, proceedings which have been sanctioned by Her Majesty's government and by the legislature of the country, and more especially in respect that there's been an infringement on the liberties of our constitution, so that we could not now constitute this church without a violation of the terms of the union between church and state in this land, as now authoritatively declared. I must protest against our proceeding further. The reasons that have led me to come to this conclusion are fully set forth in the document which I hold in my hand, and which, with the permission of the House, I shall now proceed to read." And he read the protest that had been adopted just 2 days before. And the moderator, Welsh, he announced a withdrawal. All those who'd formed that protest, he announced that they were withdrawing from the assembly and separating from the established Church of Scotland. Welsh read that document, the protest. He laid it on the table, turned to the Royal Commissioner, Lord High Commissioner, bowed to the Lord High Commissioner, recognising, yes, the crown. He left the moderator's chair. And then he went down the aisle of the church. Thomas Chalmers followed him. And then the evangelicals who were there followed in procession. Cheering broke out in the galleries. And then, as we said, row after row of ministers, elders, filed out. Till, well, in the assembly anyway, over 200 commissioners left the assembly. Went down the hill to Tanfield Hall. It's no longer there, though there's still a plaque there to recognise that the first Free Church Assembly took place there at Tanfield Hall at the Water of Leith. And at Tanfield Hall, Dr. Welsh opened the proceedings, then nominated Thomas Chalmers as moderator. Now we've reached the 23rd of May 1843, the first General Assembly, the Free Church of Scotland. It devoted its whole afternoon to signing the Act of Separation and Deed of Dimission, what you see in the picture here. It was signed by 474 ministers and later on by 192 probationers. And then on the 30th of May 1843, General Assembly of the Free Church of Scotland concluded. And the upshot was, I mentioned at the start, I'll mention it again, a third of ministers, a third of the membership of the established church, and almost all the Gaelic-speaking congregations followed. And just looking at this just this morning, in fact, of these 474 ministers who quit the established church, 101 of them, it was over 20%, actually preaching Gaelic from the pulpit. So that gives you a flavour of, the numbers that we're talking about. It was an exodus that led to the genesis of a new church. And they were free at last from the intrusion of the civil powers and the whole way that ecclesiastical practice was managed. But then, what about the social consequences of the disruption? Because this is something that we don't generally think of and don't generally realise or put our minds to. You see, the disruption really occurred through an innate sense of injustice. Injustice in regard to the appointing of ministers to congregations. And at the same time, there was this desire to establish spiritual independence from state control. That was really revolutionary at the time. Now, yes, so we've seen that in the disruption, but there was more to the disruption than just focusing on the principle of appointing ministers to congregations. There was really a deep commitment to fairness, to justice, and that's seen particularly in two areas as a consequence of the disruption. Two areas. One is education, and the other's in relation to ministers' salaries. Let's look at education. Because immediately after the disruption, it wasn't just 450 plus ministers who seceded from the established church. Many school teachers had aligned to the new denomination. And because they were identified now with the Free Church and not the established church, they were actually deprived of their positions in teaching. They were booted out of the parish schools, booted out of private schools. You had landowners like the Duke of Sutherland. He actually removed these teachers from their positions in his land. And almost 400 teachers across Scotland, those who adhered to the Free Church, they were removed from their posts. Now, as I said, that there's the whole matter of justice in relation to the appointing of ministers. But equally there was this whole matter of justice in relation to teachers. And what we see is the Free Church, the new denomination, acting quickly to remedy these injustices. There was a scheme that was adopted to raise £50,000 to write 500 schools, and that £50,000 was to be raised by Free Church contributors. Now, £50,000 in today's equivalent is something like £7 million. And in the space of 1 year, £52,000 had been raised simply to erect 500 schools and to pay for the salaries of these teachers. 52,000, something like £8 million in today's equivalent. And that's really an astonishing sum when you consider that this was money that was raised on top of the funds that were needed to build new churches and new manses and, of course, salaries for ministers. What was the upshot of this? Well, you go to May 1845. 280 schools have been constructed, 513 teachers employed, 44,000 pupils registered in these schools. And you can go to 25 years after, just a few years bore free church schools were included in state Education Act of 1872. But 25 years after the scheme, Chalmers scheme had been set in motion, we see nearly 600 schools functioning, 633 teachers, 64,000 pupils. And the total sum that was raised to rent these buildings, to pay for the teachers' salaries. If you look at the 26-year period between 1843 and 1869, in today's equivalent was something like £75 million. So we have to look at the aspect of justice in relation to education, provision of education for Scottish children. And this, I think, brings us on to the subject of equality. We mentioned that Chalmers had devised a scheme to pay for ministers' salaries. And on 20th of May 1843, Chalmers submitted what's known as the Sustentation Fund. And again, this was unprecedented in the funding of clergy. As we said, this is the basis of equality. According to the scheme, the Sustentation Fund, each congregation was to collect all that it could for general support of all free church ministers. All this money was to be sent to Edinburgh, was sent in quarterly instalments. End of the year, an equal dividend was paid out, irrespective of the size of that minister's congregation. Whether he was in a large city congregation or a small Highland one, the money given was exactly the same. Somebody at the time said it was share and share alike. And really, there was Chalmers was a brilliant organizer. And collectors were appointed to visit the homes of the parishes, the areas, do it once a month. And the money was collected, given to the deacons in the congregation. And in turn, that money was sent to the Central Treasury in Edinburgh. But these collectors were male and female collectors. The scheme wasn't a success. Chalmers had wanted the salary for a minister to be, in that day, of 1840s, £200 per annum, which in today's terms was about £27,000. But the first year of the scheme, the equal dividend only paid out £105 to each minister, or roughly 14,000 per annum. See, there were more ministers coming into the free church. The more ministers, the less money to go round. 1845, the stipend had reached £122, or roughly 16,000. Still not enough, really, to give ministers to function properly. But, we've seen this element of equality, justice, and you can see that even in the way that Thomas Chalmers expected money to be raised even from the poorest of free church people. You'll have heard, I'm sure, Chalmers' famous power of littles. He said if every free church family contributed a penny a week, £100,000 could be raised. And he actually argued at that time snuff was a big thing. And he said if the cost of every 10th pinch of snuff was contributed, then the free church would have a sufficient means to pay the stipends of ministers. So he said for every 10th pinch, and put that cost to paying the salaries of free church ministers. So what have we seen in relation to education, sustentation? What we're seeing really is a culture of enterprise. Enterprise, ingenuity to promote the principles of fairness and justice. And, really the disruption, so really it provokes a spirit of new beginnings. The exodus out of the established church. leading to the genesis of a new denomination. And, in that exodus that leads to the genesis, there are new ideas, there are new ventures. And really, it did breathe new life into Scotland's, ecclesiastical, social makeup. There really was a dynamism in the new church. It did change Scottish life. And because there was such a dynamic change in Scottish life, brought about by the disruption, a memorial to the men, and as you'll see in the picture, well, there were women there as well, to those who made that change. And the decision was that there'd be some memorial to capture what happened on the 18th May 1843. And it's the amazing painting. Many of you I know have seen it. So no doubt will be discussed more fully on Saturday. The famous disruption painting. There's going to be so much more to be said in it. I'm not going to say anything with the technological background to the painting. I'm not going to go into even the details of those who are in the painting. What we do need to realise, and again, this is coming to a cultural basis, what you need to realise is that the founding fathers of the Free Church, they weren't cultural Philistines. I mean, David Octavius Hill, this painter, was also a Free Churchman. This artist had proposed to paint a picture of the First General Assembly. The initial idea was not the grand scale that you see in the mind today, but he had this idea to commemorate the event of 18th May. And it was one of the leading Free Church ministers, a man called Dr. Robert Gordon, who discussed D.O. Hill's idea. And D.O. Hill's plans were modified in discussion with Robert Gordon. And eventually, it was decided there was going to be this great painting done. And the Free Church raised, again, a substantial amount of money to buy the painting of D.O. Hill, something like £200,000 in today's money. And one of the reasons for the purchase of the painting actually was to prevent Americans from taking it over the Atlantic. But the serious point's this: it was commemorative. It's not a factual painting. There were people in that painting who weren't even there on the 18th of May. But it was to commemorate this great event, because the disruption was a popular event. It was people-centred. There were men and women who were included in that vast array of people. There were 457 individuals. So you can count them if you don't believe me. I mean, if the disruption gave the people a voice. It gave the people a voice to express their own wishes against the intrusion of the civil powers in the church decisions. And if the disruption gave the people a voice, then the people have to be seen. People have to be seen in that great act of 18th May 1843. Because the people who were given that voice showed a self-sacrifice. They showed a devotion to principle. And, whatever our position, whatever our stance on the disruption of 1843, surely, the very least, we should applaud these people for their commitment, for the commitment to principle. So, we've looked at these events that really, I hope, give a bit of a background to the bigger picture that it's not a mixed metaphor, a bigger presentation to the exhibition that the museum in Eilean's showing. But we've just had a short time to consider the causes of the disruption and certain elements of cultural consequence. But I hope we've seen something of the conviction and the commitment of a very large section of Scotland's population. And even that commitment seen in that painting. Now, I know we're looking at what happened in 1843 from a long time distance away. Let's not adopt, what some people have called a chronological snobbery. In other words, what's really relevant is what happens nowadays in the present. Let's not dismiss these past times let's not dismiss them as, having no consequence for the present. Let's admire those. These men, these women, these people who are willing to sacrifice their livings, to sacrifice their material security. And they did it for a higher principle, and that's captured in that painting. And let's not belittle these people. Let's respect them for their integrity of those who were instrumental in the disruption of 1843. So maybe that's enough for this evening.
Thanks very much to Nigel for a really interesting talk. I was just wondering if anyone would like to ask any questions.
Sorry, I didn't realise I'd gone on so long.
I'm not sure what the time is. Probably we could, if people are happy to stay, we could probably spend 5 to 10 minutes on questions.
Or even discussion, even if.
Or a discussion. Anyone would like to make any comments? One thing I was thinking about, Nigel, was the influence of the education system that was introduced.
Yes.
So what was the number of free church schools that were established? Did that have a big impact on the overall number of schools in Scotland? And, did it have an impact on things like literacy and all that sort of?
It's interesting in this book here, some of you will have it. I know the Annals of the Disruption by Thomas Brown, he actually refers to what you're asking. And he mentions that, the free church schools that, were quickly established, they were actually inspected by government inspectors, and the government inspectors, by and large, commended these schools for their high level of literacy, the standards that were set in these schools. So it was no surprise that in 1872 they were incorporated within the state system. So, without going into any particular detail, it seems that yes, they did have a significant influence on the general education of Scotland.
What was the involvement of the SPCK, the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge at that time?
At that time, I'm sorry, I don't know. It might be someone who's more up to date than that than I am, but can't give a definitive answer anyway. But certainly one of the consequences again in terms of education were the ladies' schools, many parts of the Highlands and Islands. So there was this drive for certainly, not the Christian knowledge, when I say for the promotion of Christian knowledge, but there was this drive to educate the, dare I say, the word masses. Yes, in fundamental basis of Christian faith, but also, of course, in general education. Yeah.
And another question, sorry if I'm hogging, just to say if everyone else can join in. Something else that occurred to me was that not long after the free church was established, there was a potato famine.
Yes.
And obviously that had a huge impact on the Highlands.
Yes.
And I think the free church was instrumental, if I'm correct, in raising funds to suffering as a result of potato famines. So I don't know whether that history is all that well known in terms of the different things that were going on in the 1840s.
Yes, very much so. Perhaps there was so much going on then. And again, it's chronicled how much the Free Church did help, in the potato famine. And again, monies were raised and, very much a Free Church initiative. So again, you're looking at sort of cultural consequence of disruption, and you look at Thomas Chalmers and his initiatives, his drive. That's seen, definitely. Again, Thomas Brown highlights that in his book, of the Disruption. How significant the Free Church was in preventing famine. Oh, right.
You think the Free Church would have been different to Thomas Chalmers survived?
It's a very good question, because he died young. I mean, he died in his 60s.
About 4 years, 5 years.
Yes, I think he was an ill man at the disruption, to be honest. If you see photographs of him, he was very, very, ill. I mean, he was a kind of man that, sort of lived two lives in one. Would the Free Church have changed? I think it may well have done so, because 25 years after the disruption, things changed. It's changed the denomination. And yes, I think things may have moved in a different trajectory. It's lived longer, definitely.
When did patronage actually end in the church?
It did end, and the year, can someone help me the year? I'm not good with years. It was at 74. Yes. So, the Church Scotland did get rid of it. It was seen as being detrimental to, ecclesiastical whiteness. Yeah. Not 1872.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I was wondering about the money
Yeah.
raised at a time of huge poverty,
Yes.
and the Highness and Anderson.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
the famine and so on. Was there any big donations coming to them from any particular sort of?
Absolutely. In fact, donations came not just from Scotland, but worldwide. Again, the monies that are registered are quite extraordinary. Every month, fantastic sums have come in, not just from Scotland, but England, America, and Free Church men who would actually go down to England and raise money south of the border. So it was quite an amazing time of, I keep using the word enterprise, but yes, fantastic sums from sympathetic people, who could see the justice of the disruptions caused. Yes. The pennies as well as the pounds.
Does anyone else have any other questions, thoughts, or observations? One other thing that just occurred to me as well, Nigel, when you were talking about money coming in from America and Canada, presumably, do you think that was people, because people have been forced, clear through the clearances,
Yes.
that they were kind of sort of wanting to fund something that they saw as challenging the rights of landowners?
Undoubtedly, yes. I mean, there is a story of someone who was ejected from his land with the Duke of Sutherland, and years later, this man became very wealthy. I think, and when the Duke of Sutherland had hardly any money, this man had plenty and didn't give to Duke of Sutherland anything that Sutherland asked him. So yeah, there was undoubtedly, because of the clearances and forced immigration, yes, there was undoubtedly an anti-landlord attitude. Not all landowners were bad. Not every, this act of patronage was bad. But when a practice becomes abused and a landlord is given this excessive power and an unjustified power, and you can see the wrongness of it, and very much.
Some churches.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's the same principle.
Thank you. Well, I think we've had a really interesting talk from Nigel, so I think we sure appreciate it.